The ongoing trade spat between US President Donald Trump and the European Union has spilled over to the automobile industry now.
The European Union has been particularly tough on the United States. They make it almost impossible for us to do business with them, and yet they send their cars and everything else back into the United States. And they can do whatever they'd like, but if they do that, then we put a big tax of 25% on their cars, and believe me, they won't be doing it very long.
It would seem that President Trump's favorite weapon is to threaten countries with tariffs, and no country, not even its allies, is exempted from it. China, Canada, Mexico, and India have all been threatened with tariffs by Trump. Right now, it is the turn of Europe. We can understand China, Russia, India, and even Mexico, but Europe? Well, it seems that President Trump is truly committed to his America First agenda. Hence the reason for using tariffs as a negotiating tactic with countries he believes are treating the United States unfairly. As you heard from the video, Trump has threatened to impose a 25% tariff on Europe's automobile industry. The question is, how will Europe face this threat? And will Europe's economy survive? Let's find out. Recently, President Trump pledged to raise tariffs on European Union nations unless they increase their purchases of American oil and gas to narrow the trade gap with the United States. He told the European Union that they must make up their tremendous deficit with the United States by the large-scale purchase of our oil and gas. Otherwise, it is tariffs all the way. If Trump followed through with his threat, the tariff could target Europe's most sensitive industries, including automobiles, luxury goods, and steel. However, one of the sectors that would most likely feel the hit the most is the automobile sector. Already, automakers in Germany, France, and Italy are bracing for the impending tariffs. For example, the Association of the German Automotive Industry has said that everything must be done to ensure that new US tariffs are not imposed. Simon Schwitz, the spokesperson for the association, stated that, "I think that both sides need to talk to prevent this. If it does, we both know what will happen next. And the European Union will probably have some measures in response, and that would be the start of another trade conflict or something of that kind. And that's not what we need. Europe and the US need to understand that, looking at all the geopolitical challenges, we need to work together, and that politics and economics need to be considered together." Well, unless European countries are ready to heed the demands of President Trump, it's unlikely that Trump will go back on his words. Germany, Europe's biggest economy, is the largest exporter of passenger cars to the US, accounting for 23 billion euros worth of exports in 2023. This represents 15% of Germany's total exports to the US. In fact, the automotive industry is already experiencing some difficulties, with Volkswagen recently announcing the closure of 3 plants. According to a German analyst, the prospect of US tariffs on European autos is likely to make a bad situation in Germany even worse. Interestingly, a recent study found that 186,000 jobs could be lost over the next decade as the industry switches to EV production. Slovakia is the 3rd largest exporter of passenger cars to the US, just like Sweden, with 4 billion euros worth of exports to the US in 2023. Notably, its passenger car exports account for nearly 3/4 of its overall export package to the US. This means that just like Germany, Slovakia is acutely exposed to the looming threat of Trump tariffs. Aside from the automobile industry, the steel and aluminum industry would also be affected by Trump's tariff. The US and Europe still have not fully resolved the issue of tariffs imposed by Trump during his first administration. This has already caused a significant slump in exports. Negotiations between the European Union's president and Biden's administration had been ongoing on how to improve the situation. However, since the US election campaign, negotiations have been stalled. The hope then is to continue negotiations with President Trump following his resumption of office in January 2025. Meanwhile, France and Italy are in crisis mode with regard to its wine industry. The US is one of their largest wine markets. French vineyards depend heavily on American demand. So, imposing tariffs could severely hurt this critical industry. It's quite obvious that the threat of Trump's tariff is shaking the foundations of Europe's economic stability. Already, Europe is dealing with slow economic growth, inflation, and mounting internal unrest. Adding a trade war to all these will certainly upend the stability of Europe's economy. However, President Trump seems determined to supposedly put Americans first. During his campaign, Trump routinely said he would work to ramp up America's fossil fuel production, even though the United States produces more oil than any nation in history. He has promised to loosen regulations on new drilling and fracking. So, his message that Europe must buy more energy from America is consistent with his pledges. However, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the U.S. is already the largest supplier of liquefied natural gas to Europe. Since the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war, Europe has largely weaned itself off Russian natural gas, making large-scale purchases of gas from America to make up for some of the difference. Despite this, Europe exports far more to the US than it imports, hence the reason for the trade gap between the US and Europe. As you know, right from his first term, Trump has consistently lashed out against trade gaps as evidence of unfair trade practices. This was the reason why he started a trade war with China in 2018. And now, he is about to do the same with Europe. But is the US trade deficit an external problem? Most economic analysts believe that it is internal. However, Trump has chosen to pass the blame to other countries instead of looking inward. Trump's threat of tariffs is a major part of his plan to change the US trade deficit. But the question is, will it work? From the US trade war with China, we can see that tariffs didn't change the situation. From 2018 till now, the US trade deficit with China has continued to increase, meaning that tariffs are not the solution. So, it goes to reason that imposing tariffs on European countries will not change the US trade deficit with Europe. The tariffs will simply hurt Europe's economy and the US economy as well. According to the Dutch bank, Trump's tariffs would shave approximately 1.5 percentage points off European growth, translating to a potential 260 billion euros economic loss, based on Europe's estimated 2024 GDP of 17.4 trillion euros. If this happens, the European Central Bank, ECB, may be forced to respond aggressively, slashing rates to near zero by 2025. In contrast, the US Federal Reserves may continue raising interest rates, leading to one of the biggest and most sustained monetary policy divergences between the ECB and the Fed since the inception of the euro in 1999. The outcome of all this will be a weaker euro, which could offset some competitive disadvantages for European exporters, but would increase import cost. It is also possible that the European economy would slide into a recession in response to higher tariffs. The question now is Europe ready to deal with Trump's impending tariffs? From what we can see, Europe does not have a clear-cut plan or strategy to deal with the tariffs. There are divisions in the EU, with some favoring a strategy of retaliation, while the others favor a negotiation. Officials in Brussels and national parliaments are beginning to brainstorm possible retaliation or alternate strategies that do not involve taxing Americans. Similar efforts are happening in the European Union, with analysis being made on the impact certain tariffs would have on different European countries and sectors. The group is discussing what American products to potentially target for tariffs in retaliation. However, these discussions are preliminary. According to some European diplomats, European Commission trade officials have not communicated with member states about a possible response, in part out of fear of appearing to want to proactively impose tariffs on America. However, some have suggested that the European Commission could act as it did during the first Trump administration in 2018, when it implemented retaliatory tariffs on $3.2 billion of goods made by companies in areas where Mr. Trump had strong support. That included tariffs on motorcycles by Harley-Davidson, based in Wisconsin, and on other products including bourbon, playing cards, and orange juice. Those vying for negotiations with Trump, however, stated that the European Commission should offer to increase imports from the United States, especially in energy and defense, as part of negotiations with Mr. Trump to avoid tariffs. But at the same time, the European Union also needs to be ready to implement retaliatory tariffs. Already, European officials have floated the idea of increasing imports from the United States, including liquefied natural gas, to placate Mr. Trump. Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, suggested a similar move in late November and warned against retaliatory tariffs. Another approach suggested by some is to appeal directly to Mr. Trump's top team about how European companies have US factories, and to explain how any tariffs could force them to shrink their US workforces. However, during Trump's first term, German officials and administration tried this approach, but it did nothing to protect them from the tariff. So what approach should the EU take to counter Trump's tariffs threat? First, the EU should engage bilaterally with the US to seek to avoid the imposition of tariffs. This means that it should offer to consider measures that facilitate bilateral trade and economic security cooperation, while making it clear that any trade measures adopted by the EU will be consistent with WTO rules. The EU's offer should be backed up with a credible threat of retaliation that could be implemented if the US decides to impose tariffs on EU exports. Retaliation could take the form of a negative list. The EU would increase its tariffs on all US exports to the same level as the US tariffs, except for products imported from the US identified as crucial for the EU. Secondly, the EU should act to preserve a functioning rules-based multilateral trading system, including on dispute settlement, and should continue to pursue WTO reform. To this end, the EU should build a coalition of countries, including key players from the global north and the global south, ready to lead in this endeavor. Finally, the EU should expand its network of bilateral and regional preferential trade agreements. The priority should be the ratification of the agreement with Mercosur, but the EU should also aim to improve trade relations with the United Kingdom and Switzerland, and to further strengthen partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region and with Africa. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share this video.